Zoom and get ready for our third program on nutrition. We've all heard and are perhaps acolytes of the great adage, "You are what you eat." Well, it wasn't too long ago that our understanding of what we eat and its effects not only on our weight, but on our very health and well-being were vastly understudied and arguably underappreciated. But within the last decade, marked advances have occurred in this field, especially related to cancer prevention. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Marlene Malik, who has been the inspiration behind the Nixon National Cancer Conference from its inception. In addition to being an active and registered nurse, she co-founded with her friend Dr. Ellen Siegel, Friends of Cancer Research, a nonprofit advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., and now serves as vice chair. In addition, she is a member of the board of directors of MD Anderson Cancer Center and Duke University's Cancer Center, and perhaps most importantly, she is a member of the board of directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation and a friend. So please welcome Marlene Malik.
Good afternoon, and following our healthy lunch, it's appropriate to move into the important topic of nutrition. So just a few months ago in September, the Biden-Harris administration hosted the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. Now, this conference came 52 years after the first White House Conference on Nutrition that was organized by President Nixon. Yeah. And at that 1959 Nixon administration conference, 5,000 participants developed 1,800 recommendations to overhaul the country's effort to combat hunger and malnutrition. In a successful example of bipartisanship and collaboration between the public and private sectors, almost 90% of those recommendations were implemented, resulting in major expansions to the food stamp and national school lunch programs, and the creation of a supplemental feeding program for women, infants, and children. It's called WIC, and the development of dietary guidelines and nutrition facts labeling. So many of the successful initiatives from that conference are still being used to guide health and nutrition to this day. The importance of the interplay between diet and cancer cells is acknowledged and accepted. For patients, new research and development in this area of particular interest, relevance, and importance. So today's panel on nutrition is moderated by Dr. David Heber. Dr. Heber is the founding director of the Center for Human Nutrition at UCLA, where he has been on the faculty of the School of Medicine since 1978. He is Professor Emeritus of Medicine and Public Health, and he is founding chief of the Division of Clinical Nutrition in the Department of Medicine of the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He is also former chair of the Medical Nutrition Council of the American Society for Nutrition, which is the largest scientific society in nutrition. And he is also a fellow of the American Society for Nutrition, which is the highest honor the society confers. So please welcome Dr. Heber.
Thank you very much. This afternoon, we're going to have a session on nutrition and cancer. As was mentioned, I've worked in this field since the late 1970s, and I'm sure my early research benefited from the National Cancer Act signed by President Richard Nixon. Today, I'm joined on the panel by Dr. Will Lee, who's the CEO and president of the Angiogenesis Foundation, and Dr. Richard Lee, who is director of the Integrative Cancer Program at UC Irvine, which is part of their Department of Support Services. I probably got the titles quite wrong, but in any case, he's a leader in integrating cancer with supportive services, including nutrition. And then remotely, we have Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, who's special advisor to the provost and dean for policy of the Tufts Nutrition School, the John Mayer School, and he's the John Mayer professor at that school. And he's this year taken a special effort to activate information to the public from the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health, which was mentioned. And then we also have Dr. Susan Mayne, who is the director of the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition at the FDA, which we call CFSAN, and she's also been an active researcher in nutrition and cancer. So I'd like to start my comments by doing something very practical. Today we had a wonderful healthy lunch that Dr. Lee and I and other members of the panel helped to design. And what you may have noticed when you looked at your plate was that there were multiple colors on the plate. There were red tomatoes, purple blueberries, green arugula, which was different than the green bok choy and some of the other lettuce. And then you had wonderful fruits, citrus fruits as well. So you had a representative of many different plant families. And I think it's important to note that humans evolved on a plant diet that had all these various varieties. And these substances are antioxidants. They also go into your body to various tissues in your body. They localize in those tissues. We have some wonderful examples of that. And they are anti-inflammatory. And maybe, Will, would you like to comment a little bit about angiogenesis and what it does there?
Well, one of the nice things about this conference is it's really based on the fundamentals of understanding cancer biology, which is a rapidly moving plane with lots of cellular, molecular, and genetic biology tied to our immune system, and then broadening it out to the microenvironment and then to the macroenvironment, and then to behavior. And behavior is really where food comes in, because we all make choices 3 times a day, sometimes more. And we're beginning now to understand how to pull all these things together. And one area that ties together cancer biology, the micro and macro environment, and our behavior is our circulation. And how our circulation grows is through a field called angiogenesis. Angio meaning blood vessels. Genesis, how it grows. We all have 60,000 miles worth of healthy blood vessels in our body that bring oxygen and nutrient to every cell, every organ in our body. And how what we eat actually influences the health of those blood vessels. Cancers can hijack those and corrupt those blood vessels, so they pull vessels to feed themselves, without which a cancer could only remain small, about the head of a matchstick or smaller. But once the blood vessels touch the cancer, the tumors can explode 16,000 times in size. And the same blood vessels that feed cancers also allow cancer cells to escape into the circulation to metastasize. So our ability to keep circulation healthy, that's really our whole cardiovascular system, is in fact really tied to food. So certain foods can help to normalize, help to streamline our circulation, but also can help to cut off the blood supply, the errant blood supply that cancers might try to take. Some of the foods that are out there, edamame, which you actually had, soybeans, mushrooms, tomatoes have lycopene, which can do this, green tea, a whole series of actually foods that contain bioactives have been studied in the lab, can studied in the clinic, and also studied in population studies as well.
Yeah, and we can go with angiogenesis not only down to the level of the tumor cell, which can only grow a few microns in size without growing new blood vessels, but we do this in other parts of our body. We do this in the heart. When you exercise, you get low oxygen in certain parts of your heart. the heart grows blood vessels. So in that part, angiogenesis is very good. There's another place where you grow them. It's going to lead me to our next panel member, and that is the central stomach. You know, we talk about the freshman 40. People go to college, they eat too much, they exercise too little, and next thing you know, this thing grows like a tumor, and it grows very rapidly. And the cells outgrow their blood supply, and the cells die and send an inflammatory stimulus around the body. And this is so prevalent in America today. 1 out of 3 Americans is obese, 1 out of 2 Americans is overweight. And this is a pandemic in our country. It's epidemic around the world, but here in the United States especially. And I'd like to ask Dr. Mozaffarian if he could comment on what's happened in this country between 1970 and 2010 to the standard American diet, which we call the SAD, or SAD diet. And Dari, could you comment on this? I know you've studied it extensively.
Well, yeah, obesity. So first, it's a pleasure to be here virtually. I was hoping to be able to get there in person, but was not able to do so. And it's also a pleasure to celebrate Nixon's legacy, not only of the National Cancer Act, but of the 1969 White House conference that he did with Jean Mayer. You mentioned on the Jean Mayer professor, Jean Mayer, who founded our school, organized that conference with President Nixon. So it's really a pleasure to be with you. I'll talk about obesity, but I hope we can also later talk about the direct effects of foods on cancer, because from recent research that we've done, those effects are larger than the obesity-mediated effects. But in terms of obesity, this is not only a national epidemic, it's a global epidemic. There's not a single country in the world that has had even a plateauing of obesity. We have a global systems problem of obesity. And what's striking about it, I think, is that while clearly it's related to changes in food, especially in our country, physical activity hasn't changed that much. Obviously, our genes haven't changed that much. Food has clearly changed because of the Green Revolution and processing of food and many things that were done in the last century to create shelf-stable, sufficient calories for 8 billion people. Because of those very conscious decisions, we've had industrialization of agriculture, industrialization of food, and that's dramatically changed our biology of interacting with food in a way that's led to obesity. And it's not just led us to eat more. And I really want to emphasize that we published an analysis just a few months ago showing that while between 1970 and 2000, calorie intake steadily went up in the United States as we became more obese, after 2000, calorie intake has actually plateaued or even gone down a little bit while obesity has continued to rise. So there was kind of this initial hit of processing of food, monocropping. We can talk about why that might have led to obesity, that led to the obesity epidemic. And now we have a self-fulfilling vicious cycle of obesity where even without calories going up, we are getting more obese. And I believe this is due to much more complex biology than just calories in, calories out, related to impacts on our microbiome and how much of our calories our microbiome consumes versus our bodies consumes, effects of small non-coding RNA like microRNA that gets transmitted generation to generation, effects of diet quality in the food we eat on actually metabolic expenditure, on mitochondrial use of ATP and electrons. There's as evidence from animal experiments that the kind of food we eat actually affects energy use in the mitochondria, browning of fat, brown fat, adipocytes that give off heat and burn energy. So there's so much interesting complexity, and I think what we've learned is, again, we have a global obesity epidemic. It's definitely due to changes in our food system as the primary cause, and we don't totally understand what's happened, especially in the last 20 years, but it's clearly causing more cancer.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You brought up the microbiome. And about 10 years ago, I met a professor at UCLA named Sid Feingold, who was in his 90s and had a laboratory where they could grow the bacteria of the microbiome over at the VA hospital. And we started a collaboration working on the microbiome. And I can say the microbiome has revolutionized nutrition science. And with what happened at MD Anderson and immunotherapy that you heard about earlier this morning, it's no question that the microbiome importance in terms of therapy of cancer suddenly went way, way up. So we look at this microbiome, and of course the first idea is, oh, I'll just throw a probiotic in there, I'll find some fiber that'll change the microbiome. No, the microbiome is a forgotten organ in your body. It's 14 trillion bacteria, 1,000 different species of bacteria that live in communities and share DNA among themselves. And they make things from what you eat. So what you eat, what you don't digest and you pass down into your colon, gets fermented into other compounds, short-chain fatty acids, substances like indole propionic acid that go to your brain and act as antioxidants in the brain. So this is a systemic microbiome, just as cancer is systemic. And the really exciting part is that 70% of your immune system cells are located in the intestine proximate to the microbiome. And those bacteria interact with the immune cells that are going down there and sampling what that microbiome is like. So today, we're developing something new. There's a $170 million effort at the NIH called the Nutrition for Precision Health Initiative, and there are 6 clinical centers around the country today looking at nutrition in a new way called precision nutrition, where you look at the anthropometrics of the person, their body weight, their body composition, but their genetics, their epigenetics, the microbiome, their physical activity, their sleep patterns, their stress level, their environment, their socioeconomic status, all these things put together. Why do I bring it up? Because after the National Cancer Act in 1971, the randomized control trial was the way that cancer moved ahead. They were able to systematically study different forms of chemotherapy and other therapies to help cancer patients and move the field forward. However, when we do a randomized control trial, we enter in those subjects and we assume they're all the same. Well, we'll do some and compare. Well, they were about the same weight, their gender was, they're not significantly different. But we don't talk about the detailed biology of each person. And that's the future that's very, very exciting, is to look at how we can take the cancer patient and integrate what we know about nutrition into their status and look at how that affects responses. And that's the very exciting area where we can merge precision oncology with precision nutrition. I think that's a really exciting area. And I'd like to now go to Susan Mayne, who also participated in the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. And Susan, could you tell us briefly, I've known Susan for a long time. She's actually quite a distinguished scientist who worked on some of the early trials in beta-carotene and various types of cancer. But what I'd like you to talk about today is what is the federal government and the FDA doing about this issue of nutrition and cancer?
Great. Thanks, David, for having me here today. And yes, I was a researcher for many years working in cancer prevention and control, across the whole continuum, survivorship, all of these issues. And the science is exciting. The investments that the federal government, including NIH, are trying to make on the precision nutrition side are also very exciting. But in the meantime, we need to do what we can to turn this tide of diet-related chronic disease and the obesity-related conditions and metabolic syndrome. And that was what really motivated the White House conference to come together. It's hunger, it's malnutrition, it's epidemic of diet-related chronic disease, and what can we do as a federal government and all of society to try to address these problems now, the urgent need to turn the tide. We know our healthcare costs are largely driven by a lot of these diet-related chronic diseases, and we need to do better. So I was honored to be one of the participants in the White House conference this year, really highlighting some of the tools that FDA has through things that many of you may not even realize in the past. We didn't have access to the information, things like the nutrition facts label. I'll note we updated that in 2016 to put added sugars on for the first time so that consumers have additional information on added sugars. But we're also working on how to create a healthier food supply for everybody. We mentioned behavior change and the importance of behavior change. We're also looking at FDA and in the federal government is how do we create a healthier food supply for everybody in the absence of behavior change. And some of the work that we've done, some of it may more impact the cardiovascular side of chronic disease risk. But I will note that cancer survivors are at heightened risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So examples where FDA was able to take actions to essentially remove the artificially produced trans fats, the partially hydrogenated oils from the U.S. food supply. That creates a healthier food supply for all using the authorities that we have. We've been working also on sodium reduction to try to lower the amount of sodium in the U.S. food supply, which can help reduce cardiovascular disease risk. I'll also note sodium is implicated in certain cancers like gastric cancer as well. So we're working on creating a healthier food supply for all and also starting earlier in life, because we've all seen once a child is on a trajectory, starting with overweight, the likelihood that that child will grow up to be an overweight or obese individual is very, very high. And so much of our work is also focused in on early in the life period. Some examples are trying to create healthier school meals for the children in this country. And that means more fruits and vegetables. That means lower sodium. That means getting children adapt to healthier moods so they start on a healthier trajectory for the future. You spoke about the different vegetables, the phytonutrients, the colors there. We need to get those things into the diets of our children so that they get accustomed to those. They know what they are. They become familiar with them, and that becomes incorporated into their lifestyle. So we are working with USDA and in partnership to try to get healthier school meals for all. So really translating all the exciting science that you're all talking about, but really bringing it at the macro level to the populations to try to impact public health at a more, high level. And it's not just here in the U.S., it's globally, because as you heard, the obesity epidemics and some of these diet-related cancers, are increasing globally. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, both at the micro level and all the way up to the macro level.
Well, thank you, Susan. People may be puzzled why it was the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health, and what hunger has to do with it. But, it's an interesting fact that women who are undernourished have small babies. Those small babies, when they're born into an environment where there's excess fat available and excess sugar and sedentary lifestyles, are at an increased risk of getting obese. So we have places around the world, countries where they've never seen obesity before, where there's only been malnutrition. And today they have a rising incidence of obesity, particularly in urban areas. So you'll have small obese small, undernourished mothers and obese babies in the same environment. And so the healthy nutrition has to start in the prenatal period, during gestation. That's when a lot of the epigenetics is happening in the uterus, and it's an important time for the baby to develop that. And then during breastfeeding is when the immune system develops. So we know that breastfeeding babies, there's a certain bacteria called Bacteroides infantilis, which gets into the baby's digestive system, and the immune system develops around that first bacteria for a period of time before the child is exposed to other foods. And we know that early exposure to a wide variety of adult foods also is a risk factor for obesity. So these are many of the problems. But, the metabolism of the tumor is very much like the fetus, to stay on that theme for a moment, and that is that when you don't eat and you're asleep at night, about 40% of your genes are turned off, and you're starting the early adaptation to starvation. So by the time you wake up in the morning, there are tiny amounts of ketone bodies that I could detect in your breath with an analyzer, and you've all heard of the keto diet where people starve or they fast. Well, this fasting that you do at night immediately starts that process, and part of that process is taking amino acids from the protein in your muscle to make glucose for your bloodstream, for your brain, and for your red blood cell. So that process starts when a tumor starts to grow as well. And I want to ask Richard some of the practical aspects, because I've worked for a long time on what we call cancer cachexia, which is the wasting of cancer patients. But there's also sarcopenic obesity, where people have high fat and low muscle. And you're in the clinic, you're on the front lines, Richard. Give us a view of what you do for the cancer patient practically.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel. And I'm a medical oncologist at City of Hope Lennar Foundation Cancer Center, but I also wear the hat of medical director for integrative oncology. And so both of those hats, I get a lot of questions around nutrition from patients I'm treating, recently diagnosed, who might be undergoing chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. And then we also have to think about kind of the survivorship period. So it's really, two different time zones in terms of thinking about how do we help patients with this idea of nutrition. I really like the idea that David mentioned about precision nutrition. I think that's where we're moving toward. I was talking with Tom Gajewski yesterday, who you heard earlier about immunology in terms of some of these studies that are coming out in terms of how do we use things like probiotics or bacteria that may actually alter the way we look at immunotherapy in response to treatment. I think right now, because we're still studying that, it's really thinking about patients and helping them in a much more practical sense. Because when patients are undergoing treatment, they're going through the nausea from the treatment. They might have just had, patients I see with stomach cancer just had half their stomach removed or the entire stomach. And so it's really challenging in thinking about just the basic nutrition. So I think as oncologists, we haven't done a great job, to be honest, around nutrition. We often have ignored it. And I think some of my colleagues, I hear from my patients, I asked my doctor about nutrition, and they said, oh, just eat ice cream, get enough calories. But I think we're really moving away from that with the data that's growing from other researchers that nutrition is really important. We have to identify malnutrition. We have a lot of dietitians at City of Hope early on. That's our goal, is to help patients even when they're not quite in treatment, but prepare them for treatment, whether it be stem cell transplant or surgery, especially if they have things like pancreatic cancer that affect their digestion. So help them early on through treatment and then through survivorship. And so we may not be able to meet all the goals that are out there because they're going through treatment. So we really have to be practical and work with patients one-on-one, figure out where they are and where can we get them. And also think about socioeconomic issues, social determinants of health. Are there other resources we can really help patients get through that? And then once we get into survivorship, I think we have a little bit more room to be more aggressive with our approaches with nutrition and really try to get them to meet the guidelines. I think they're very good guidelines already out there. The American Cancer Society earlier this year put out their guidelines for nutrition and exercise, which are really based on a panel of experts coming together, looking at the evidence. And so I think, and ASCO actually has put out guidelines for nutrition and exercise during treatment as well. So I think we really work with these guidelines, help patients, try to get them, meet them where they are, and then try to get them to optimize as much as we can. And then in survivorship, I think we can really move forward and be more aggressive and really help them reduce the risk of recurrence and help them be healthy and recover.
Well, one of my strategies over the years has been to recommend a dietitian to work with an oncologist. Today, the registered dietitians in the United States need to get a master's degree in order to be registered. And I have a joint appointment at USC where I teach in the School of Gerontology. They have a master's degree program for dietitians at USC. And those dietitians are always looking for jobs where they can go. So when I assign a dietitian to an oncologist, two things happen. Number one, the oncologist loses weight. That's number one. It starts eating better, okay? And then the second thing that happens is he's incorporated nutrition into his clinical program. And that's the most important part, because I've seen all the different kinds of, over the years, I've had all kinds of interactions with oncologists. I've worked with a number of oncologists over the years, very successfully, but there are many who say, I'm too busy to do this, I don't have time to do this, I don't want to do this, and I understand that. And so therefore, a dietitian in their office, that person can then spend time and talk to the patient and say, what are you eating? What can I do to help you in a practical way at a ground level? So I think that's very, very useful. And you brought up the idea of survivorship. I think, there's 16 million cancer survivors today. It's a growing population. There's supposed to be 22 million by 2030. So this is a population that we can treat with the same principles we use in prevention in general. So, type 2 diabetes, I call it diabesity. It's about 95% are obese people. We can use preventive strategies to do that. And I'm particularly impressed by some of the thinking that Dariush Mozaffarian has done on this with regard to prevention in the community and how we can address this obesity, diabetes, actually at the grocery store. And Dariush, would you like to share some of your ideas that you presented in the Nutrition as Medicine? Or medicine, no, I forget, it's Nutrition as Medicine, right? Initiative, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think first it would be good to just step back a little bit and comment on what we know about nutrition and cancer specifically. So first, there's a lot we don't know. And so I think that we need to have a major new moonshot and investment in nutrition and cancer. And that's not really been talked about in the new Cancer Moonshot as much as it should be. There was a recent announcement at USDA would be creating a virtual center to combine and bring together people doing nutrition and cancer research, but with zero new resources. So, my optimism for something with zero new resources having a major impact is not high. So I think that's really important. But what we do know for example, from the American Institute for Cancer Research and World Cancer Research Federation, they've systematically reviewed the evidence for how foods affect cancer directly outside of obesity, outside of diabetes. And basically there are 7 kind of major food groups that have probable or convincing evidence for direct effects on cancer. It's low intake of whole grains, low intake of dairy foods, low intake of fruits, low intake of vegetables, those four protective foods. And then on the adverse side, the biggest one is high intake of processed meats, which have been declared a class 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization, high intake of red meats, unprocessed red meats, and high intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. We've done an analysis, a national simulation model, estimating that those 7 food groups, not eating at kind of recommended levels of those 7 food groups, causes 80,000 new cancer cases every year. And that's about the same number that has been estimated to be attributable to all of alcohol use. And so that's a big number, 80,000 new cancer cases per year. The biggest group of that is the GI cancers, colorectal cancers at the top, about 52,000 new cancer cases a year from poor diet. And then mouth, pharynx, and larynx cancers, about 14,000. So I think that's really, really important. We need to focus on getting more healthy foods to patients and fewer unhealthy foods, in particular processed meats. And by the way, those burdens were larger in Black and Latinx Americans than in white Americans because of worse diet. In terms of how to start to fix this, right, there is no single silver bullet. We are working on a range of initiatives. I think my own personal top 3 priorities, where I think we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck, are around food as medicine, which is the concept of integrating food and nutrition into healthcare. Number 2 is advancing nutrition science and really having major new investment, structure, and authority in nutrition science. And number 3, in advancing nutrition security through our federal programs, not just food security, getting enough calories to people, but advancing nutrition security where the food is also nutritious. Now, in the first category, just as a brief example of what I mean by food as medicine, there's an intervention called medically tailored meals where patients with some significant diseases like cancer get medically tailored by a registered dietitian meals, 10 meals a week, delivered to them at home at no charge, paid for by their insurance. And multiple studies have shown that this improves health outcomes and lowers healthcare utilization. At Tufts, faculty member Feng Zhang here is leading actually the largest randomized controlled trial of medically tailored meals called NutriCare. It's a multi-center study, including the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center, Tufts Medical Center, Temple Health Fox Chase Cancer Center, and MD Anderson Cancer Center. And it's going to enroll 300 patients with lung cancer, a very difficult group of patients to enroll, as you know, and randomize them to medically tailored meals plus education or control. And the preliminary results so far, with about half the patients enrolled, looking at some of the secondary outcomes, show that the patients do better and actually have less side effects from chemotherapy in the medically tailored meal arm. And I think Will has thought a lot about how food interacts with chemotherapy. So that's one food as medicine intervention. Ensuring adequate physician education around nutrition is another. But I think the bottom line is there are really clear policy and systems changes that we can make around integrating food and nutrition into healthcare, around advancing nutrition science, and around advancing nutrition security in our federal food programs, SNAP, WIC, and school meals, that would really make a difference.
I think it's an interesting parallel we've been making throughout the day of lessons from the COVID-19 epidemic. And the people who did the worst in the COVID epidemic were people with diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. So clearly that subterranean or that terra firma underneath all of this comes also in our cancer patients. So when they present with us, they may have pre-existing problems. And in the cancer survivor population, it turns out that many of them get a second primary cancer after being successfully treated for cancer. And those second primary cancers tend to be in people over 65 related to diet and lifestyle changes. So I think this is an area where we have an opportunity to really make an impact on angiogenesis and other areas. And Will, would you like to comment on what we could be doing more for the cancer survivor population?
Cancer has been, as we've heard in previous panels, is making its transition from looking at the tumor and throwing spears at it. with the hope of actually knocking out the cancer. In the last couple of panels, we talked about how do we actually support the body's physiology and ask not the question, why did we get the cancer, but why don't we get cancer more often? And that answer actually leads us to understand that, in fact, the physiology of the normal, healthy human body is actually rigged, well-rigged, hardwired to be able to suppress cancer growth. We naturally have the ability to control inflammation, which is a trigger for cancer growth. We normally have the ability to resist blood vessels from growing into tumors. We normally have the ability to repair DNA that would otherwise be mutated to cause cancer growth. And we also normally have the ability to maintain a good, healthy gut microbiome, which talks to the immune system, which is normally rigged to be able to conduct surveillance looking for early, errant, microscopic cancers that we form in our bodies all the time. And so to some extent, the flip of the whole mindset is really how do we help the body do what it normally wants to do rather than simply throw things at the body. And I want to just point out one comment that I think is really helpful because we're having a policy-oriented conversation. We're talking about a molecular nutrition conversation. Listen, eating healthy is actually quite natural. And if you take a look at the traditional recipes that are delicious, not only the lunch we had today, but if you look at the Mediterranean, if you look at Asia, traditional recipes found in those nations are built of those ingredients that science has now rediscovered to actually have those healthy bioactives that act to activate our body's health defenses that can serve anti-cancer. So for the consumer, we don't need to go into the complex biology. That's a conversation that we have here in this room. For the consumer, they need to understand, simple ideas that you can eat healthy, tasty, nutritious meals that actually are based on time value traditions that taste great. Nobody wants to actually be stuck to a program of elimination. People want to actually go towards the things that they desire. So part of this is educating those of us who are involved with interacting with patients that you can eat things that you love. And I always sort of say, love your food to love your health. That's a good alignment that people can get behind.
Well, I think that, to your point, our U.S. diet has evolved in a certain direction, and Dari related to that a little bit. It had to do with the Depression and the fact that people in the 1930s were malnourished and just didn't have enough calories. So the discovery of certain types of hybrid corn, where it took one man working 1 acre for a year to feed one person, you now could feed 120 people from that 1 acre of land. So we had all this corn, and it was used to make meat to radiate and send to the troops in Europe. And then after the war, you had all these silos full of corn. You turned it into corn oil, into all kinds of margarines and all kinds of stuff. And so it became an area where we had a disconnect. And it's amazing that in 1970, we only had about 10% obesity. People were working hard. There were less, you weren't driving your car as much. You had fewer appliances. You had things, you were working harder every day. So I think as we look at the American diet, we have to accept the fact that there's going to be a period of evolution. And, I think, Susan, as you work in the federal government, you can see this closely working with USDA, but there is an evolution. 50% of all the fruits and vegetables in America are grown here in California. I was one of the original members of the California Avocado Commission. Avocados were not eaten in the Northeast. If you went to Boston, you got green food coloring and mayonnaise for Super Bowl weekend. Now the avocados are international. They were grown right here in Brea, California, not far from this Nixon library. The original tree called the Hass avocado was right here. And from that one tree, it was grafted onto other trees. And now around the world, that one avocado is an international agricultural product. So I think there is hope as people get more educated that we can get away from the brown beige diet and get more toward a colorful diet. And Susan, you're right in the melee. Could you comment on, your interaction with USDA and how you can foster that through FDA? It's food, drugs, and cosmetics, but about the food.
Yeah, happy to. And I think you highlighted so many pieces there. One piece of that is that the food supply continues to evolve, and we can expect a whole lot more evolution in the U.S. food supply in the years to come. And FDA's role there is to try to help support that innovation while making sure that it's safe. And the reason we want to support innovation is to give consumers choices, but those consumers need to be empowered with information to make those choices, and the food needs to be safe. So if you look at, and you mentioned California, you're all sitting out in California. California has had challenges with drought. And meanwhile, biotechnology is addressing new crop varieties that are more resistant to drought. And our role at FDA is to make sure that genetically engineered crops or gene-edited crops are safe. And I think many experts realize in order to feed the global population of the future, we need biotechnology. And so the U.S. is leading many of those biotechnology efforts. In the past, the biotech was really more for the benefit of the farmers in terms of things like weed control. But now what we're seeing is the biotechnology in crops today, many of those are for the benefit of the consumer. So that's, for example, creating genetically engineered or gene-edited crops that have enhanced nutritional value. There's a lot plant breeders can do. And so we do work on that whole issue. USDA and EPA are partners as we look at the evolving food supply through what we call the Coordinated Biotechnology Framework. So USDA's job is to make sure that these gene-edited crops, for example, are safe for other crops. Our job is to make sure that they are safe for humans. And so that's an example of where we play a really important role. But the other thing you highlight is how the food supply has changed so dramatically. We import so much more than we did in the past. The lines of food imported into this country have dramatically changed. And when you look at things like fruits and vegetables, a very substantial proportion of those are imported into the U.S. right now. That gives us more variety, but that also has things we have to think about from a food policy systems perspective for the future. If you look at something like seafood, an important source of omega-3 fatty acids, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, more than 90% of the seafood that comes into this country is imported. And so we have critical roles to play as we look at that changing food supply of the future to make sure it's safe and that we can continue to provide foods to feed the growing population of the future while making sure consumers are informed about what these products are. So interesting conversations about the evolution of the food supply and what that means for our populations going forward in time.
I think that's a fascinating area for discussion of the preventive values of foods, because as we look at what I like to call phytonutrients, other people call phytochemicals. I think it makes it sound too toxic to the public. I like phytonutrients better. They were originally called phytochemicals because they didn't have any calories associated with them, but they have tremendously powerful effects on cells. And in our laboratory, we're able to show that some of these phytonutrients can be very beneficial in terms of various mechanisms within cancer cells and within normal cells to promote the tumor microenvironment and to promote the whole host in terms of their immune system. And we know one thing, that if you deprive people of food altogether, one of the first things to turn off is their immune function. There are skin tests like for tuberculosis and mumps and so forth. If you look at those skin tests and you apply them to a malnourished cancer patient, they'll have a negative test. As you re-nourish that patient with nutrition, the tests can sometimes come back. So we know that immune function is modulated by nutrition in very important ways, probably through the microbiome. Richard, would you talk about a little bit about what you do to help nourish your patients in an acute basis?
Right, I think those are all great points. I just want to echo William and Dariush's point about education. I think even oncologists as well as patients undervalue the importance of nutrition and how much it can really help them feel better, tolerate the treatment better. So I think that's an important area of policy, is educating and really emphasizing the importance there. I think in terms of the microbiome immunology, I think that's a really interesting area, very hot topic. One of our colleagues at City of Hope, Monty Paul, published in Nature Medicine how a simple probiotic with a specific species of bacteria altered the response rates in kidney cancer patients to immunotherapy. And it's probably why I got into Nature Medicine, because it was quite a dramatic difference in responses. Dr. Gajewski and I were talking last night. Apparently there's growing data that certain probiotics may actually have the opposite effect, that when you use them, they might actually have anti-inflammatory effects. And so certain probiotics may actually decrease the efficacy of some immunotherapies. So I think there has to be a lot more research. I think someone mentioned that when a panelist mentioned there needs to be more research put into the area of nutrition. And I think we're finding that, especially in active cancer patients, some of these nutritional interventions may have a real impact immediately and not just long-term, but immediately on the efficacy of the treatments we're giving, such as immunotherapy. So Dr. Gajewski, actually, I asked him this question about what do you recommend, because he helps treat melanoma patients. So he generally recommends a high-fiber diet, plant-based. He doesn't recommend any specific probiotics because he says, there's not enough data. We don't know which one's helpful, which one may not be helpful. So he tends to recommend, probiotics through foods like yogurt. He feels like it's a safe type of intervention. So really kind of following the basic American Cancer Society guidelines on plant-based, more plant-based, fruits and vegetables, avoiding red meat, processed foods, and then thinking about more fiber seem like important strategies at this time.
Well, it's interesting that, the fruits and vegetables also have the fiber as a prebiotic as well as a probiotic. You may not know the difference, but probiotic's a live bacteria. Prebiotic is something the bacteria eats that then affects the bacteria's growth. And fibers and phytonutrients, things that they're colorful compounds, are actually prebiotic as well. And they produce things, the bacteria, called postbiotics, which then can affect your immune function and other functions in the body. So as we start to consider the overall effect of nutrition in the cancer patient, we have to have some guidelines, and I think that the public health gives us those common sense guidelines. I think one of the hesitations is people have become so obsessed with nutrition and multiple supplements and so forth that they have ignored their healthy nutrition. So I think the common sense guidance that Will was coming back to is really important, to eat your traditional diet. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, no, I think there's another aspect to add to this we haven't mentioned yet, which is the importance for trusted sources of information. And I think that's something that, academic centers try to do. The FDA, obviously, and the government is a source of that. But if you really take a look, just search nutrition on the internet or on Amazon, and you'll see all these claims and products and thought leaders that are out there. And honestly, the consumer has no idea who to trust. You're looking at a panel and an audience of people that are probably much more educated than the typical consumer. And yet, something we learned from the pandemic is that if you go with the science, you got to watch out for misinformation. And then if you take a look at an area like food, there's a lot of polemics out there as well. There are people that believe in this or believe in that. And so where is the confused but earnest consumer going to get their information? That is something that I think we all need to collaborate on. I'm advocating for sort of an annual conference of physicians that is not necessarily nutritionists, but really allow us to address the confusion that we have in managing patients and really invite the people that are the true experts and then make that type of convening publicly available so they can see how we as medical scientists have this conversation so we don't have the answers clearly laid out yet, but this is a journey to find those answers.
Well, it's certainly a complex area. We've talked about everything from public health down to the endothelial cell generating a protein that stimulates angiogenesis. So I think we've got time. If there are any questions from the audience, I think we could take those questions now and be happy to take those. You must want to have some information about nutrition. There you go. We're going to ask Anna Barker. There we go.
That was really great. I learned a lot. Thank you all. I had a question for our FDA colleague. I just read this morning that my colleague, our commissioner, actually said today that FDA was going to start paying a lot more attention to food. What do you think that's going to translate into?
I think you're on mute.
I don't know if he's checked in with you on this or not. So.
Oh, yes. We've been discussing this a lot. So what I would say, Ann, and it's good to see you again, is when it comes to food, we do have challenges on the resource side at FDA. An example of that, my budget in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition doesn't have any user fees. And on the medical product side of FDA, the vast majority of the budgets are coming from industry paying those user fees. So what it means is we need resources on the food side of FDA, and a recent report that came out really highlighted that. You may be shocked to know that the center that I lead has the same number of employees that we had in 1978. But the complexity of the work that we now have to execute with the increased number of import lines, with the technology that's coming. We recently completed our first consultation on cell-cultured food. So it's just the complexity continues to grow, but the number of people I have has not grown. And so we are hoping that a big emphasis will be put on the food side of FDA, because from my perspective, we touch every American every single day, and we would like to see a greater emphasis. I will note that the White House conference agreed with us and actually put a request in the deliverables of the national strategy to better resource the center that I lead in the area of nutrition. We've also spoken about nutrition research. Nutrition research is foundational for all of our work. And many people have pointed out that we really could use more research, fundamental foundational research in nutrition. So one of the things we have been doing is working with NIH to try to make sure that when NIH funds large cohort studies like All of Us, or like the ECHO cohorts that look at people at the earliest, the prenatal period, what the mom is eating, what the infants are exposed to. We'd like to see those cohorts well resourced to collect high quality dietary data, so that we can do the types of nutrition genomic interaction research that is so important. All of us, as you know, is investing in significant genomic information. We need to augment that with great exposure information around nutrition, and that will be the high quality data that we need for precision nutrition going forward. So I can tell you I'm all over Washington advocating for research and resources to put a bigger priority on nutrition for all the reasons you've heard here today.
You know, it's fascinating. The nutrient database developed by USDA, they date back to 1973. And many of the foods that are in the nutrient database are no longer on market shelves. And I'm working with a nonprofit that's working on an open source data for everyone to use in nutrition science, so we know what's in our food supply. So nutrient analysis is kind of the foundation of precision nutrition. If we don't know what foods people are eating, we can't really speak to all the other aspects of the genetics, the epigenetics, et cetera, if we're starting off with the wrong information. So I think that's a really important area, and I think it's interesting because the food industry in many ways is larger than the drug industry and could certainly afford those user fees. And so I think it's an issue of assuring people that this is not going to, I know early on when I started talking about nutrition, people, oh, you're going to ruin people's confidence in the American food supply. And I said, no, that's not the issue. You're going to get a better food supply, and I think that the USDA needs to understand that we're working to make things better and not to stop things from happening. And there'll be a natural evolution over time to a better, healthier diet as we all work together on this problem. And that will ultimately have an impact on cancer. I take the example of liver cancer, which originally was due to moldy peanuts or whatever, today is overwhelming, or hepatic viruses, but today is overwhelmingly due to fatty liver, which affects 40% of all overweight and obese patients, and then a small number of them get liver cancer. So we can see the impact of foods, yes, toxins, yes, but also obesity and overweight and sedentary lifestyle. Okay.
David, can I add something to this comment?
Sure, go ahead.
So, as we talk about the overlapping disease conditions that are relevant here, cancer, obesity, diabetes, fatty liver, the gut microbiome, and the need for more research, we did a systematic analysis of nutrition research and published a detailed paper on this a couple of years ago and shared it with the government, with the U.S. government. We're not going to get to where we want to go, at least not in the next 10 years, unless we actually fundamentally change the structure and authority of nutrition science. And what we believe is the top recommendation is to create a new National Institute of Nutrition at NIH. And so the same way the National Cancer Institute was created by a coalition of a small number of people who went to Congress and said it's time and really dramatically transform cancer research, it's time to do the same thing. It has to be congressional action. The administration can't do it because of statute. So Congress has to create a National Institute of Nutrition. The budget should be additive to all other research funding. It shouldn't take away from any existing projects going on anywhere. We don't want to silo nutrition research, but $1 billion or $2 billion a year for a National Institute of Nutrition would be very, very sensible. The estimates are that poor diet costs our economy $1 trillion a year in healthcare spending and lost productivity. So 1/1000th of that a year, would be a very, very good investment. And so I really want to call on everyone in the room to speak to your elected representatives, talk about this, that Congress has heard about this, and it is possible, especially with the momentum of the White House conference, to actually get Congress to act and create a National Institute of Nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a tremendous, great support in the room also, Dari. I think, that it's interesting, when I was a director of a clinical nutrition research unit, actually related to the NCI, and there were 8 of them in total. And I remember having discussions at the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive Kidney Diseases, and I would raise the issue of obesity, and the director at that time, well, we know how to do research. Don't tell us about obesity. It's just don't tell me about it. And then there came the mark on obesity. There was funding available. All of a sudden, the next meeting, he goes, we have always been enthusiastically working on obesity, So I think that money will move the needle, and I do think that your idea is a good one, and it would be very important. Yes, Andy. Andy von Eschenbach, former director of the NCI and the FDA, wants to make a comment, so let's hear from Andy.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to follow up on your comment because it's incredibly important. To get another institute at the NIH is going to be a formidable challenge, but ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Programs and Agency that is now being created for health, is in place, and its agenda is just starting to evolve. I would really suggest that in addition to efforts about another institute, you really focus on ARPA-H and getting nutrition into that agenda. Because it's there, it's been approved by Congress, funding will come, and you ought to be at the front of the line.
Yeah, ARPA is an amazing agency for advancing research, and a lot of the breakthroughs on the defense side have come through ARPA. And now with ARPA-H, that same innovative spirit toward health advances that we need in nutrition and cancer can come. Okay, other questions? Over here.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm not a researcher or a physician. I'm actually just a docent here, but I'm the son of 2 former cancer patients. My father passed away 2 years ago from it. My mother passed away many years ago from another illness, but she had it at the time, it's breast cancer. My question is just how closely tied does the data indicate sugar is in the diet to a broad range of cancers at this time for just regular people who have maybe not the best of diets and not the worst? Thank you.
Sure. Well,
I'll tell you how I answer that question. Most people are perfectly able to process normal amounts, moderate amounts of sugar, especially the sugars that are naturally found in fruits and vegetables, as an example. And it's not a problem. And there are some people that really, sort of state you should stay away from all fruits and vegetables. That's way kind of like over the boundary in terms of what the evidence shows. In fact, quite the opposite. So what I would say is that what's clear is that added sugar, a lot of added sugar, which in this country we eat a lot of, it's present in our industrialized food, that actually has all kinds of domino effects that can actually lead to chronic disease, including cancer. Now, there's, for every urban legend or popular idea about sugar or soy or some other tomatoes with lectins, there's an urban legend surrounding it, and then voices that actually propagate these, really false messages. They're false totems. And what I think we should understand is that if you have diabetes, you need to actually, or metabolic syndrome, you do need to be careful about the amount, the volume of sugar you eat. But if you get it from whole plant-based foods, you're going to be just fine. I think that's the key thing. The other thing I would actually say that's really important is that there's so much emphasis, and I think a little bit of the discussion today has touched on this. There's an interesting tension industry is motivated to spend money to tell people what to eat, oftentimes the food that's not so good for us, as research known. Physicians, on the other hand, have been trained to kind of tell people what not to eat. And so we kind of demonize foods as well. And so you've got two voices that really are very confusing for the consumer. What we do need, and I think this is what a new institute or ARPA-H and collective research could do, is to focus on not so much what we should remove. I think the bad guys are pretty well known. And we don't need more voices to say what we shouldn't be eating. Human nature abhors deprivation, and nobody wants to hear another bad word about a food. But what everybody wants to know is what I should add. What should I add to my diet? And this is where a medically tailored meal for cancer patients could be incredibly important. And it's going to be personalized because everybody's different. Everybody's a different metabolism. Everybody has a different backstory, comorbidities. And that's really where you can't generalize something like sugar, although that's a natural question.
Well, I'll just add quickly, in clinic, and just like where you're saying, William, is that you'll see patients come to my clinic and say, well, I heard sugar is bad, and I'm not going to eat any sugar. I'm going to go on a ketogenic diet. And when patients do this very kind of extreme diet, they come back 2 months later, their hair is falling out, they've lost 50 pounds. I said, wow, what happened? Well, I'm not eating any sugar. I said, well, look, that's not, they've gotten misinformation, they've gone too extreme, and it ends up causing more harm. And then I have to convince them, look, let's come off of that, let's come back to a more balanced Mediterranean style diet that meets all your needs, not one of these kind of extreme fad misinformation based diets. So it can be quite harmful. So I appreciate all your comments. I agree with everything, and it's really a balanced approach and going for kind of natural foods and avoiding the processed added sugars and those things.
Yeah, the problem with nutrition is everyone who eats is an expert on nutrition. That's the problem. Go ahead.
Sarah, can I add on, David, just on the added sugars?
Sure, and then we'll wrap up very quickly. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just, and Dr. Lee spoke to it. You've got fruits that contain sugar, but when you're eating those fruits, you're eating in the context of a nutrient-dense food, right? And people understand that. Same thing, lactose is a sugar. And so when you're consuming those dairy products, you're consuming a sugar. And so the critical need was to differentiate what are added sugars from those that are really coming from these important food sources that we've heard are really important for cancer prevention and overall health. So that was the criticality of getting added sugars on the nutrition facts label for the first time in 2016 with a daily value. And the importance there is we worked with other federal partners, including the National Cancer Institute and their dietary modeling group, to say that that a healthy diet can incorporate some amount of added sugars. But if you have too much, you're either going to overconsume calories or you're going to miss out on key nutrients that you need. And so it's a critical thing that we need to work on in terms of education. That's the importance. And we've worked with health professionals. We've produced videos and things to educate health professionals on how to work with patients on things like the nutrition facts label, including added sugars. But just a few comments from a regulatory perspective, what we've been trying to do on the added sugars landscape.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank all the members of the panel. I want to thank the audience for their attention and interest, and we'll wrap it up right there. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our third panel. Our fourth and final panel on technology and medicine will begin at 2:30 p.m.